Jon Snow's breath hung in the frigid air as he stood upon a narrow ridgeline in the Frostfangs, that far north stretch of the world where few men dared venture. In that silent domain of ice and wind, jagged peaks and dark chasms, he found himself recalling the weight of his vow to the Night's Watch. The world had changed so drastically, though, that he no longer wore black. The Night King was gone, the White Walkers laid to rest. The fragile peace that followed the Great War had splintered alliances, and Jon had found himself turning south to serve the living in other ways, discovering that his lineage was more complicated than he'd ever dreamed. Yet here he was again, in the land of eternal cold, crossing into wild territory in search of stories that trickled up from rumor. He was not alone. By his side, roped together for safety as they ventured the treacherous passes, was Gendry, the only surviving son of Robert Baratheon, now forging his path in a kingdom still plagued by the aftermath of war. They had come north at the urging of tales older than the reign of Targaryens, stories of hidden dragon lairs. Since Daenerys Targaryen's quest, the notion of dragons had always centered around the far south or the exotic east, but never so far north. Yet the rumor they followed was persistent. Hidden away in a cave system near the Frostfangs lay relics from a time when Targaryen princes explored every corner of the continent to secure vantage points for power or to hide away dangerous secrets. Neither Jon nor Gendry was entirely sure they believed in the possibility of dragons' eggs here, so far from the warmth dragons were said to need. But rumors had a power of their own, and both men had found themselves drawn to the possibility of forging a new path for Westeros. Since the final battles, a new wave of chaos had swept over the Seven Kingdoms. Cersei was gone, but so were many rightful heirs and claimants. The realm teetered on the brink of another conflict. Jon, with Targaryen blood running through his veins, had little desire to claim the throne, yet some still whispered he was the rightful heir. Gendry, newly legitimized as a Baratheon before Daenerys' fall, now held Storm's End. He tried to rebuild his ancestral seat while forging alliances with lords who had known his father. But the world was not so easily mended, and so they had gathered their small retinue, wildlings who respected Jon and a few loyal knights who respected Gendry's lineage, and set off into the unknown. They pressed deeper into the mountains, the crunch of their boots lost in the howling winds. The nights were long, the winter cold seeping into their bones despite thick furs. Neither man complained, for they had endured worse. Jon recalled the long night, the endless battle on the ramparts of Winterfell. Gendry remembered the bite of the freezing wind as he rode away from Dragonstone, years before, alone in the blackness of the sea. There was a certain kinship born in adversity, and though they had not spent much time together in the past, they found in each other a shared determination, a will to see Westeros united, not at the cost of more devastation, but through cooperation and hope. After days of searching, they arrived at a jagged cliff face where the rumors hinted at a hidden entrance. The wind had begun to pick up again, swirling eddies of snow around their ankles, so thick that the world around them seemed a blur of white. One of the wildlings, Kral, gestured with a hand, pointing to a fissure in the rocky wall. Jon's gray eyes narrowed as he stepped closer, gloved hand brushing away a curtain of wind-blown snow to reveal a narrow crevice. He felt the old sense of foreboding he used to get when patrolling beyond the wall. Carefully, he slipped in. Gendry followed, carrying a torch he sparked to life with flint and steel. The cavern walls were slick with ice and moisture, each step echoing in the gloom. It took them several dozen yards of slow progress before the space opened into a broader cave. The flicker of the torch revealed ancient carvings on the walls, symbols of dragons, spidery runes that might have been Valyrian. Jon recognized the style from old Targaryen architecture. Gendry, though less learned, could sense that these markings were important. The air inside was far warmer than outside, and that alone was uncanny in such a place. They spread out into the cavern, passing a small subterranean lake fed by trickles from the icy peaks above. The rest of the wildlings and knights accompanied them, carefully shining their torches into every nook and cranny. At first, they found nothing more than collapsed rubble and shards of broken stone. But deeper within, the cave twisted sharply downward. They followed it in a single file, climbing over slick rocks, the air growing noticeably warmer with every step. A subterranean thermal vent, perhaps, or a volcanic pocket that no one had known was there. When they finally emerged into a hollow chamber illuminated only by their torchlight, they found 3 large shapes nestled into a natural alcove in the stone. At first, they thought them to be boulders, but it soon became clear these were eggs, large, stone-like, and patterned with faint scales. Jon knelt, heart pounding, to examine them. Gendry stood at his side, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. Dragon eggs. Real unmistakably. So reminiscent of the 3 eggs Daenerys Targaryen had once hatched in Khal Drogo's funeral pyre, only these looked older, covered in a thin film of dust and crystals of ice that had slowly formed on their shells over the centuries. It didn't seem possible that anything of the sort could survive in this cold, but the warmth radiating from the thermal vent might have been enough to preserve them. After the initial shock wore off, Jon gently brushed away some of the frost. A strange stirring welled within him, as though some part of his blood responded to the presence of these sleeping dragons. Gendry, feeling only awe and a flicker of excitement, realized they had stumbled upon something of immeasurable value. A single dragon egg might have been enough to set the entire realm into uproar. 3 could shift the balance of power entirely. Their retinue gathered around in hushed wonder, though 1 or 2 of the more superstitious wildlings made signs to ward off evil. None of them entirely understood how or why these eggs had ended up here, but there was no question that these relics once belonged to Targaryens or their agents. It occurred to Jon that these eggs might never hatch, that they might only be petrified lumps of old magic. Yet he also knew the stories. His aunt, Daenerys, had hatched dragon eggs that were said to be turned to stone. The notion that heat and blood had awakened them lingered in his mind. Jon felt both drawn to them and afraid of what it might mean to wield dragons. Westeros had already burned under the might of a dragon queen in recent years, but he also remembered the awe and hope those creatures inspired when he first saw them flying overhead. Dragons were not just instruments of destruction. They were symbols of power, belonging to the rightful kings of the 7 kingdoms. Jon had never wanted that power, but if it could be harnessed to unite the realm, perhaps the realm would not tear itself apart again. They carefully wrapped the eggs in layers of fur, ensuring they remained warm, though the presence of the vent and the surprisingly sultry interior had likely kept them viable all this time. The question now became what to do with them. Jon and Gendry locked eyes, a silent conversation passing between them. Jon's Targaryen heritage made him a natural figurehead for those who still yearned for the old monarchy, while Gendry's Baratheon name and pragmatic approach endeared him to lords who disliked the Targaryens or were uncertain about a Stark's claim. The idea of forging a partnership, however tentative, seemed an appealing notion. If these eggs could be hatched safely, they might bring about a renewed sense of stability or, if abused, plunge Westeros back into flames. Jon did not wish to keep them secret from everyone, but he also knew that revealing them too soon would spark chaos. With little debate, they agreed to carefully transport them out of the Frostfangs and keep their discovery hidden until they could decide how best to proceed. The return journey south was a grueling one. Their small band navigated the narrow crevices and steep slopes once more, carrying the precious, weighted bundles. The weather turned harsh, with blizzards rolling in. Snow and ice battered them, forcing them to shelter in cramped caves or behind large outcrops of rock. The eggs seemed to pull heat from their bodies, demanding warmth even as the wind threatened to freeze their skin. The toll was high on the men, but none turned back. They all sensed they carried something far greater than 3 lumps of calcified shell. They carried the future. Gendry took particular care when one of the eggs nearly slipped from a pack horse's harness on a treacherous slope. He lunged in, sliding precariously, and managed to catch it before it tumbled into the abyss. Snow battered his face, and for a moment, he hung there, gripping the egg in both arms, legs braced against the icy rock. Jon hurried to help, securing Gendry and the precious cargo, pulling them to safer ground. Once they descended from the mountains and made their way around the western edge of the wall, they found themselves in the Giftlands near the abandoned castles of the Night's Watch. Despite the thinning population, some outposts had begun to form. The destruction caused by the White Walkers had not fully been undone, but a quiet resilience thrived among those determined to reclaim the north. Jon's presence ensured them safe passage, and though Gendry was less known, he carried himself with the bearing of a lord. From there, they traveled south by quiet roads, eschewing major inns or towns for fear of rumors spreading. They took advantage of isolated farmsteads, offering to pay the owners in gold for discreet lodging and the promise of silence. The journey was long, but eventually they found themselves approaching Winterfell, Jon's home by upbringing, and a place Gendry had come to respect as a bastion of loyalty and tradition. However, Winterfell was no longer quite the same. Sansa Stark was its lady, guiding it with a steady hand. She had weathered many storms, forging alliances with the Vale, and forging an independent northern identity. Jon had abdicated the position of king in the north to her, partly out of guilt and partly out of a deep-seated belief she would do better for the north than he could. She had not expected to see Jon so soon, nor to see him accompanied by Gendry Baratheon and a secret retinue. When the travelers arrived, weary and tense, Sansa greeted them in the courtyard, flanked by loyal guards. Her eyes softened at the sight of Jon, though she wore the mantle of authority well. The fortress was alive with the bustle of the winter markets, but Sansa quickly led them into a private solar where they could speak away from curious ears. Jon wasted no time. He explained they had discovered something powerful in the far north, something that could tilt the entire realm if it became public. Sansa pressed him to reveal it. It was then that they brought her face to face with the eggs. Though cautious, Sansa's breath caught at the sight of them. She recalled well the devastation dragons had wrought on King's Landing, but she also understood their mythical significance. She recognized that to hide these eggs might be wise, yet she also knew that rumors eventually spread. The question was not if, but when. Sansa listened as Jon and Gendry laid out their thoughts. Unify the realm through a joint claim, or at least a partnership, that might prevent another blood-soaked war. Jon with the Targaryen name, Gendry with the Baratheon name, and the North forging a new relationship with the South. Sansa's eyes flicked to Gendry, recalling that he had once met Arya, that he was Robert's bastard son. 1,000 swirling possibilities danced in her mind. She urged caution above all, worried that lords in the South would see it as another attempt at Targaryen restoration. She had come to loathe the idea of kings and queens who cared little for the people. Gendry, for his part, admitted he was no political mastermind. He was a blacksmith at heart, but also the recognized Lord of Storm's End. He had no illusions about the power in controlling dragons. He simply wanted a realm without war. Sansa looked to Jon, feeling the weight of these decisions. For the moment, she agreed to keep the eggs hidden within the crypts of Winterfell, where the hot springs and the natural warmth of the earth might allow them to remain preserved. No one would look for them there. They would bide their time making careful plans. The days turned into weeks. Word spread that Jon and Gendry had returned north, but few suspected the true reason. Gendry spent much of his time in Winterfell's forges, reacquainting himself with the craft he loved. He hammered out nails for the repair of the palisades, fashioned new helm pieces for Sansa's guard, and tested steel in the biting northern air. Meanwhile, Jon walked the ramparts, speaking with the men and women who had survived the wars. He saw the hunger for stability, the desire to never face another threat like the White Walkers or the madness of King's Landing again. Quietly, he found himself growing more convinced that dragons could be the symbol of a united realm, a realm that needed a new beginning. But the question of who would claim the dragons was still unresolved. A fragile alliance was being born. Sansa, though reluctant, recognized the potential power in forging a Baratheon-Targaryen partnership. The lords of the North might recoil at the notion of dragons once more, but if they could be shown that these two men had the North's best interests at heart, perhaps the realm could know peace. Arya's whereabouts were uncertain, off on her own journeys. Bran, the three-eyed raven, was distant, neither fully engaged with mortal politics nor entirely disconnected from them. He was said to have gone beyond the wall once more, searching for remnants of lost knowledge in the haunted forests. That left Sansa and the other local lords to shape the future with Jon and Gendry. One cold evening, after a council meeting, Jon and Gendry ventured into the crypts beneath Winterfell. Their torches cast wavering shadows against the ancient stone kings and lords of House Stark. They carried with them small braziers of hot coals and a few dried logs. In a hidden alcove, behind a sealed chamber where the old swords of the Stark ancestors lay rusted, Sansa had arranged for a space to keep the eggs. Jon and Gendry entered, placing the braziers near the eggs to warm them further. Together, they watched the firelight flicker on the eggs' surfaces, revealing hidden patterns of coloration. Faint swirls of bronze, gold, and black. Jon felt a strange stirring again, an echo of the blood within him. Gendry, practical but odd, wondered if he might actually see these creatures hatch within his lifetime. They spoke in whispers, reflecting on the chaos that dragons once wrought and the possibility of forging something better. The realm had a chance for a fresh start if it didn't tear itself apart first. Days later, a raven arrived from the Vale, bearing news that Lord Royce and the other Vale lords were questioning the sudden seclusion of the north. Whispers had begun that Jon Snow was planning something. Meanwhile, the Riverlands were in disarray, leadership uncertain after the tragedies of the wars. Riverrun was nominally under Edmure Tully, but he struggled to keep the broken region together. The Iron Islands were quiet for the moment, but their capacity for rebellion was always a concern. Dorne was aloof, reeling from the loss of its ruling family. In King's Landing, a new small council had formed under a regent who claimed to speak for the Iron Throne, but the people saw it as a puppet government. No single presence stood out as a unifying monarch. The realm tottered on the edge of fragmentation, each region turning inward. In that environment, the seeds of war were inevitable, unless a strong claim, a strong show of unity, and perhaps the promise of dragons could compel them to come together. Jon, Gendry, and Sansa recognized that time was short. They needed alliances. They needed to show they were not tyrants. While Sansa worked the Northern Lords, using her gentle but firm approach to secure their goodwill, Jon and Gendry made quiet inroads with the Vale through letters, appealing to Lord Royce's respect for Ned Stark's memory. Gendry wrote to Tarly and other southern houses, acknowledging the complex relationship they had with Targaryens, but expressing a desire for peace. In each letter, they were careful not to mention the eggs. Rumors would inevitably surface, but they wanted the official message to be one of reconciliation, not conquest. It was during one of these uneasy nights that something extraordinary happened deep in the crypts. The eggs, heated by braziers and the occasional presence of the lords who checked on them, began to show signs of stirring. No one witnessed it at first, but cracks formed, spiderweb thin, across the shells. By chance, Gendry went down to check the fires one evening and noticed one egg trembling. Alarmed and excited, he rushed to find Jon. Soon the two of them stood over the eggs, hearing faint scratching noises from within. Jon's heart hammered in his chest. He remembered how Daenerys had hatched her dragons with a pyre, with blood and fire intermingled. But these eggs seemed to be hatching under gentler conditions, warmed in the darkness below Winterfell. Perhaps the presence of the hot springs, or the combined lineage of Targaryen and Baratheon bloodlines standing near them, though that was more the stuff of lore than science, was enough to awaken them. The first egg to hatch was bronze and brown in coloration. A small serpentine neck poked through the shell, then a head crowned with delicate horns. The hatchling's eyes, greenish gold, blinked in the torchlight. Tiny wings unfurled, wet with fluid. The creature emitted a soft squeak rather than a roar. Gendry found himself unable to move, overwhelmed by awe. Jon, trembling, slowly reached out a gloved hand toward the hatchling, who recoiled, but then sniffed at the air. The second egg, black and silver, followed soon after with more vigorous motion. Its hatchling broke free with a squealing hiss, flaring slender wings. The third egg, flecked with gold and crimson, hatched last, revealing a smaller dragon that seemed weaker but no less mesmerizing. In the space of that hour, 3 dragons were born into the crypts of Winterfell. Jon and Gendry stood in silent wonder, hearts racing. This was more than they could have hoped for, but it was also terrifying. The realm had just emerged from the nightmare of a dragon's wrath. To birth more dragons was to birth the potential for unstoppable power and unstoppable destruction. Yet these were living, breathing creatures, mewling helplessly in need of warmth. Jon directed Gendry to gather extra blankets. They ushered in a couple of trusted stewards, men sworn to Sansa to help. The hatchlings were no bigger than cats, and their fragile bodies needed gentle care. No candlelight vigil or funeral pyre accompanied their arrival. Instead, a hush descended over the crypts, broken only by the occasional hiss or squeak of the newborn dragons. Jon and Gendry exchanged uncertain looks. There was no turning back now. Sansa arrived soon after, alerted by the stewards. She stared at the Ciri. Aturs, her face a mixture of shock and trepidation. She bent down, eyes fixed on the largest hatchling, the black and silver one, which eyed her back with curiosity. She reached out a hand but held it short of touching the dragon's snout, as if uncertain whether to show trust. The dragon, in turn, sniffed the air and cocked its head. The moment passed quietly, with neither party making a move. Sansa turned to Jon, demanding to know what they intended to do. Jon had no easy answer. Gendry, clearing his throat, suggested that they might try to feed the hatchlings, that they might search the old texts for any knowledge of dragon rearing. The scale of their responsibility sank in. All the old Targaryens had grown up with traditions and knowledge, father to son, mother to daughter. Jon and Gendry had only scraps, fragments gleaned from old scrolls. But perhaps that would be enough. In the days that followed, the small retinue of caretakers set up a more suitable lair for the dragons in the hidden depths of Winterfell's crypts. Here, the natural hot springs kept the space warm, and they could maintain secrecy. Word spread among a handful of trusted individuals, but beyond that, the presence of dragons was a carefully guarded secret. Gendry forged small harnesses and feeding implements, calling upon his blacksmith skill for delicate tasks. Jon attempted to read old accounts of Targaryens and their dragons, whatever records Winterfell had. Sansa and a few of her closest advisors tried to plan for the day that the realm would inevitably discover these new dragons. They needed a strategic approach, how to introduce them without igniting another war. The hatchlings grew rapidly. Within weeks, they doubled in size, and their hunger proved insatiable. Sansa had to divert some of Winterfell's stores of meat to feed them, careful not to raise suspicions. The crypts filled with the faint smell of charred flesh because the black and silver dragon in particular seemed eager to practice its flame. Wisps of smoke curled from its nostrils. The bronze and brown dragon was more docile, often curling up to sleep near Gendry's feet. The gold and crimson one, the smallest, was shy, darting away whenever anyone approached. Jon, who had once forged a bond with Ghost, felt drawn to that timid hatchling, hoping to soothe its fears. Outside Winterfell, the lords of the north grew curious about the presence of Baratheon men in the castle and why Jon had returned. Some suspected an alliance meant to overtake Sansa's rule. Others whispered that Jon might be seeking the crown again. For all of Sansa's attempts to maintain calm, rumors lingered like crows. Letters arrived from the Vale, from Riverrun, from King's Landing, each inquiring about the direction the North planned to take. Gendry received letters from Storm's End, demanding his presence to reaffirm his seat. Meanwhile, the secret in the crypts continued to grow, each day bringing the dragons closer to flight and an undeniable presence in the realm. Eventually, Sansa decided they needed an assembly of northern lords to ensure no suspicion festered. It was time to tell at least the northern bannermen part of the truth, that Jon and Gendry had discovered something of great importance and that they intended to use it to protect the north and the realm from further bloodshed. They did not explicitly mention dragons, but they asked the lords to swear to keep an open mind. The meeting was held in the Great Hall of Winterfell. Lords Manderly, Glover, Serwyn, and others gathered, their retinues filling the hall with murmured conversation. Jon stood at Gendry's side, while Sansa presided, her expression calm but firm. They spoke of the realm's fractures, of the threat of renewed war, and of a chance to unify behind a new symbol of hope. Jon explained that he carried Targaryen blood, but he had never sought the crown. He introduced Gendry as Lord of Storm's End, a man with Baratheon blood, forging an alliance between North and South that might stand the test of time. The lords listened with varying degrees of skepticism. Some respected Jon too much to question him openly. Others eyed Gendry warily, mindful of House Baratheon's tumultuous history. Yet the promise of peace under a dual leadership intrigued them. Jon suggested that the North remain largely autonomous, but that they stand with Gendry's Stormlands in forging a broader coalition, bridging the gap so often used to ignite war. Gendry declared that the Stormlands would respect the North's sovereignty, acknowledging their sacrifice in defeating the dead. He invoked the memory of Robert's respect for Ned Stark, albeit complicated, but still a bond that had shaped the realm's history. After much debate, the Northern Lords reluctantly agreed to consider an alliance. However, they demanded proof that this arrangement could truly safeguard their interests. Sansa hinted that Winterfell possessed a powerful asset, something that would deter any southern aggression and keep the North safe. The lords pressed to see it, but Sansa demurred, saying the time was not yet right. Unsatisfied but bound by oaths of loyalty to House Stark, the lords dispersed. Jon could see in their eyes that they craved reassurance, an undeniable demonstration of power, before they truly submitted to any new order. That demonstration, however, would mean revealing the dragons. And so the question was no longer if they would reveal the dragons, but how. Soon after, a letter came from King's Landing, summoning the Lords of Westeros to discuss the future of the Iron Throne under a new regent council. It was an obvious ploy by those who had taken advantage of the chaos in the capital to legitimize their power. Jon, Gendry, and Sansa knew that ignoring the summons might brand them rebels. Accepting it could place them in danger. However, they also realized it might be their best chance to stake a claim in the shaping of the realm. If they could secure alliances with other great houses, Highgarden, the Vale, Dorne, they could forge a new framework for peace. With 3 dragons, albeit young ones, they had leverage that no other faction possessed. They chose to travel to King's Landing in a carefully managed convoy. Sansa would remain in Winterfell to govern, but she sent Brienne of Tarth to represent the North's honor. Jon, Gendry, and a contingent of Northern and Baratheon knights and advisors prepared to make the journey. The dragons, still too young to fly, would remain hidden at Winterfell, cared for by a trusted handful, including a maester who had studied dragons in old texts. However, they arranged for a plan. If it became necessary, they could send for the dragons by secret means, or at least threaten that they existed. It felt risky to leave them behind, but traveling with them would have exposed them to all of Westeros in the blink of an eye. The journey south was fraught with tension. Every crossroad was filled with refugees or bandits, survivors of the last war. People recognized Jon's face, whispering the White Wolf or the Targaryen prince behind their hands. They recognized Gendry, or at least his Baratheon armor, bearing the black stag on gold. The soldiers who accompanied them tried to maintain order, though the roads were still dangerous. Though the main threat of the undead was gone, lawlessness had spread in the vacuum of stable governance. The group crossed the neck, forging through the swamps, then moved past Moat Cailin, eventually entering the Riverlands. There, they found small folk struggling to rebuild. Gendry, who had grown up as a commoner, took a personal interest in their plight, making sure to distribute some provisions. Jon, similarly moved, realized anew that the realm needed strong but compassionate leadership. Finally, they approached the outskirts of King's Landing. The city still bore the scars of fire. Sections of the walls had been hastily rebuilt. The charred ruins of old buildings had been cleared away, leaving empty lots. The Red Keep rose above it all, battered but still dominating the horizon. As Jon and Gendry led their contingent through the gates, the people thronged to see them, calling out half in hope, half in fear. The memory of Daenerys's dragon scorching the city was fresh in their minds, though it had been some time since her fall. Soldiers under the Regent Council attempted to keep order, funneling them to the Red Keep. Inside the keep's great hall, they were greeted by members of the new small council. Lord Peake was said to speak for the realm, though he came from a minor house. With him were a few ambitious lords and ladies who had seized power in the chaos. They welcomed Jon and Gendry with polite smiles, but their eyes gleamed with calculation. Jon could almost sense their relief that they saw no dragons. They likely expected him to show up with a scaled terror perched on his shoulder. Instead, they saw a man in plain leathers, bearing the Stark sigil alongside the Targaryen colors, and a tall black-haired Baratheon youth wearing good steel but no crown. For the next several days, negotiations began in earnest. The council wanted the major houses to recognize the authority of the Iron Throne under the regent, who claimed to act in the best interest of the realm. Jon and Gendry made it clear that they would not bow to an authority so dubiously attained. Instead, they proposed a radical notion: a new great council to elect or ratify a monarch who could unify the realm. They had no illusions. Their proposal was aimed at enabling Jon, with Gendry by his side, to be recognized. But they also recognized that an outright claim to the throne might provoke a coalition against them. Throughout these discussions, letters came and went from Winterfell, with Sansa sending updates on the dragon's progress. All three were growing quickly, with the Black and Silver one already learning to spit controlled flames. As the negotiations dragged on, factions formed in King's Landing. Some whispered of installing Gendry on the throne, since he was Robert's son, and Robert had overthrown the Targaryens. Others whispered that Jon was the rightful heir, being the son of Rhaegar Targaryen. The council sought to manipulate the differences between Jon and Gendry, hoping to sow discord. But the two men, though occasionally uncertain, had forged a bond of mutual respect and a shared vision for the realm. They would not be so easily turned against each other. It wasn't long before word of dragons reached the capital. Rumors circulated from travelers who claimed to see scaled creatures in the sky near Winterfell, likely exaggerations, as the dragons were not yet large enough to be so public. Whispers grew that another Targaryen had hatched dragons to seize the throne. The small council, alarmed, confronted Jon in a private session, demanding the truth. Jon, with Gendry at his side, decided the time had come to reveal enough to shift the negotiations in their favor. They admitted that dragons indeed lived once more. Jon, standing tall, explained that if the realm would peacefully accept a new coalition of the major houses, represented by both Targaryen and Baratheon blood, these dragons would be used only for protection and deterrence against external threats. But if the Regent Council continued to cling to power illegitimately and threatened open war, the dragons would be brought south. That revelation shook the political landscape of King's Landing. Suddenly, lords who had hesitated to support Jon or Gendry began reassessing their positions. They remembered the might of Daenerys's dragons, the devastation a single dragon could cause. The thought of 3 new dragons, no matter their size, placed them in a precarious position. Whispers turned to open discussions. Perhaps forging an alliance with a newly formed Targaryen Baratheon house was better than gambling on a shaky regency. Of course, there were still those who hated the Targaryen name, who remembered the Mad King or Daenerys's fury. They saw only the potential for tyranny, but the balance had shifted. Nonetheless, the council members pushed back. They demanded proof. They demanded to see the dragons. Jon and Gendry refused, insisting that the dragons remain where they were safest, in the north. The council threatened to mobilize the Lannister forces, what remained of them, to march north, or to ally with the Iron Islands to apply pressure. Tensions spiked. It seemed that war might still be inevitable, but both Jon and Gendry sensed that the council's bluster was partly fear. They had not expected a challenge so rooted in actual power. Jon quietly reminded them of the devastation King's Landing had suffered under Dragonfire. He insisted he did not wish to repeat such horrors, but that they would defend themselves if forced. All the while, Gendry made subtle overtures to houses in the Reach, reminding them that the Stormlands and the Reach shared borders and interests, that House Baratheon had no intention of ravaging their lands. He found a few sympathetic ears, especially among lesser lords who had been overshadowed by the Tyrells. The seeds of a broad coalition began to take root. In the middle of this tense standoff, a letter from Winterfell arrived, urgently addressed to Jon and Gendry. One of the dragons, the gold and crimson one, had attempted a short flight within the crypts, injuring its wing in the confined space. Though not life-threatening, the dragon required immediate care, and a maester doubted the crypts would remain a suitable environment for much longer as the creatures grew. The letter implored Jon to return or at least send instructions on how to proceed. After reading it, Jon felt a pang of guilt. These dragons were living beings, not just tools of negotiation. Gendry agreed, his brow furrowed with concern. They had no love for King's Landing, a city of intrigue and painful memories. Perhaps it was time to gather allies and bring them north to see the dragons under controlled circumstances. Yet leaving King's Landing now, in the midst of negotiations, risked the realm's future. Eventually, they struck a compromise with the Regent Council. They would hold a great council in Harrenhal, that ancient ruin large enough to house thousands, where major and minor lords could convene. There, Jon and Gendry could present their proposal for a new structure of governance. The Regent Council believed they could rally other factions to oppose the new Targaryen ascendancy, while Jon and Gendry hoped to gather enough support to legitimize their plan. With that agreement, both parties parted ways, albeit uneasily. Jon and Gendry set off north once more, determined to check on the dragons and then prepare for Harrenhal. Upon returning to Winterfell, they found the 3 dragons had indeed grown. The black and silver dragon was now the size of a small horse, able to climb and leap short distances, exhaling small jets of flame. The bronze and brown one had become quite friendly toward Gendry, rumbling softly whenever he approached. The gold and crimson dragon, shy and reclusive, was recovering from its injured wing, but it nuzzled Jon when he visited, as if seeking comfort. Seeing them like this, sentient, powerful, and increasingly majestic, reminded both men of the responsibility they bore. These creatures, if allowed to roam free, could shape the destiny of all Westeros, for good or ill. The winter snows began to thaw, though the cold lingered in the north. Harrenhal, located in the Riverlands, would be hosting the Great Council in a matter of weeks. Preparations were made. Sansa made certain the Northern Lords were at least provisionally supportive of Jon and Gendry's claims. Ravens flew to all corners of the realm, summoning lords to attend. Many doubted that a single gathering could truly settle the future of the Iron Throne, but enough were curious or desperate for peace that they agreed to come. The aura of the mysterious new dragons grew. Stories flew across Westeros, making the new Targaryen presence sound as large as Daenerys's full-grown beasts, even though in truth these 3 were still young. Finally, the day arrived for Jon, Gendry, and their retinue, now larger, with northern soldiers and Stormlands knights, to depart for Harrenhal. They carefully considered whether to bring the dragons. The black and silver one was large enough to travel on foot, albeit slowly, and the bronze and brown was nearly as big. The gold and crimson, still healing, might struggle with the journey. After lengthy debate, they decided to bring only the black and silver and the bronze and brown dragons. If the gold and crimson one recovered enough, it could be flown or transported later. This was a gamble, for revealing only 2 might undermine the aura of having 3. But they agreed it was better to keep one safe in the north than risk it all traveling together. The departure from Winterfell at dawn was a sight few had ever imagined. 2 young dragons, each chained lightly to a wheeled cart specially forged by Gendry, accompanied by armed guards. The black and silver creature hissed and snapped now and then, clearly unhappy about being confined. The bronze and brown one was calmer, though it occasionally flapped its wings restlessly. As the procession made its way through the winter town and out onto the King's Road, small folk stood on the roadside, gawking and sometimes shrieking in fear. Yet there was also a flicker of wonder in their eyes, as if they witnessed the rebirth of myths. Traveling with dragons proved no easy feat. The beasts' demands for meat were constant, and their presence unnerved horses and men alike. When they roared or attempted to stretch their wings, the men scrambled to keep them calm. Jon and Gendry took turns coaxing them, using gentle voices and offering fresh meat. A sense of nervous excitement followed them. By the time they reached Moat Cailin, they realized the dragons would not be able to pass through certain narrow gates if they grew any larger. Thankfully, they managed, though the black and silver one scorched part of an old watchtower with a burst of fire, startling many in the retinue. As they traveled south, more lords and their retinues joined the road, heading to Harrenhal. Looks of fear and awe followed the dragons wherever they went. Some minor lord might approach, bowing low to Jon, professing loyalty if the dragons would spare their lands. Others muttered about a new conquest. Yet despite the tension, no one openly attacked them. The memory of what dragons could do was too fresh and terrifying. Harrenhal loomed in the distance after many days of travel, its massive towers and melted walls a testament to the devastating power of Dragonfire centuries past. It was an ominous place for a great council, but perhaps fitting, given the stakes. The black lake glistened under gray skies. Tents and pavilions rose around the fortress, each bearing a different sigil of Westeros. The sun and spear of Dorne, the falcon of the Vale, the fish of Tully. Even the golden kraken of the Iron Islands flew from a small encampment. Somewhere among them would be the delegates from King's Landing, the self-styled Regent Council. Thousands of men gathered, knights, bannermen, sellswords. The air buzzed with tension. Jon and Gendry entered Harrenhal's massive courtyard with their dragons in tow. A hush fell. People pressed back, forming a wide circle. The black and silver dragon let out a short, piercing cry, smoke curling from its nostrils. The bronze and brown snorted, flaring its wings. All eyes locked on these living embodiments of power. Jon spoke quietly to the black and silver, urging it to remain calm. Gendry whispered reassurances to the bronze and brown, gripping its harness. They were forcibly reminded that these dragons were still half wild. This was a show of strength, but also a dangerous gamble if anything went awry. The Great Council commenced in a hastily repurposed hall. Lords of every region took seats at long tables, though half of them eyed the presence of dragons with unease. The Regent Council from King's Landing, led by Lord Peake, stood at one end, posturing, proclaiming themselves defenders of the realm. They called on all assembled to reaffirm the Iron Throne's authority. Jon spoke next, stepping forward. He declared that the realm had suffered too long under tyrants, wars, and uncertain successions. He proposed that the major houses, by majority, choose or ratify a single monarch to unite the Seven Kingdoms. That monarch would vow to honor the autonomy of regions like the North and the newly stabilized Stormlands, forging a genuine alliance rather than an imposed conquest. He glanced at Gendry, who rose and declared that if chosen, he would relinquish the idea of sole dominion, instead sharing power with Jon or whomever the council deemed rightful. The two men spoke of forging something new, a realm guarded by Baratheon and Targaryen blood, but governed by the collective voice of the houses. The council erupted in debate. Some lords saw in Jon's Targaryen name the promise of legitimacy, while others recalled the horrors of Dragonfire. Some respected Gendry's Baratheon claim, while others dismissed him as a bastard upstart. Dorne remained aloof, uncertain whether to trust any legacy of the Iron Throne. The Iron Islands demanded their own freedom in exchange for their support. The Vale's delegates, less certain now, worried about the revival of Targaryen power. The Riverlands, battered by repeated wars, wanted peace above all. Into this volatile mix, the presence of dragons was either a reassurance or a threat, depending on one's perspective. While the debates stretched on, the black and silver and bronze and brown dragons were kept in a large stableyard under guard. Yet their restlessness grew. On the second day of the council, the black and silver dragon snapped its chain and attempted a brief flight, startling countless lords and small folk who had gathered in the courtyard. It soared only for a moment, overshadowing the crowd below, before landing heavily on a crumbling tower. Fear spread like wildfire. Guards rushed to contain the beast, bows drawn. Jon, alerted to the commotion, ran from the council chamber and climbed onto a walkway that overlooked the courtyard. He whistled, calling out in a voice laced with both urgency and a strange sense of connection to the dragon. The black and silver turned its head, smoke trailing from its mouth, wings half spread. For a long moment, man and dragon locked eyes. Then, with a final hiss, the creature half glided, half fell back to the stableyard, where it allowed itself to be rechained. The crowd exhaled in relief. Jon descended, heart pounding, to check on the dragon. He found Gendry already there, calming the bronze and brown one, which had grown agitated by its siblings' outburst. Whispers spread among the lords that Jon might indeed have some unique bond, reminiscent of Targaryen dragon lords of old. Some found that miraculous, others found it terrifying. But none could deny that they stood in the presence of men who commanded dragons, or who soon might. That dramatic display swung the momentum of the council in Jon and Gendry's favor. The alternative, allowing the realm to shatter or letting the Regent Council impose a weak monarchy, seemed ever more precarious in the face of living dragons. After days more of negotiations, concessions, and alliances formed in private corners, a consensus began to emerge. House Tully, House Arryn, and several of the smaller Crownland houses agreed to support a new monarchy under Jon and Gendry, providing they bound themselves to a council that would prevent tyranny. House Martell of Dorne bargained for partial autonomy and recognition of their local traditions. The Iron Islands demanded, and were granted, certain freedoms so long as they did not engage in open piracy. The Regent Council tried to hold out, but they found themselves outnumbered and overshadowed by the dragon's presence. At last, the Great Council took a formal vote. Amid the battered grandeur of Harrenhal, in the flickering torchlight, each major house cast its voice. The North and the Stormlands voted in favor, naturally, along with a slim majority of the other regions. A new monarchy would be formed. Jon was recognized for his Targaryen lineage, but also for his status as a Stark raised in the North and a proven defender of the realm. Gendry was recognized for his Baratheon blood, legitimized by royal decree, and for his vow to stand as co-ruler or hand to Jon, forging an alliance that spanned the once divided lines. No single house would hold absolute power. Instead, the newly established Great Council would serve as a check, ensuring that no monarch could unilaterally rain fire and blood upon the realm. The motion passed by a clear majority, though many lords were uncertain, some even resentful. Still, the promise of peace under the watchful shadow of dragons was enough to sway them, for the moment. The Regent Council from King's Landing, outmaneuvered, bowed to the new order or risked open conflict they had little chance of winning. When the final words were spoken, and the decision sealed, a hush fell over the great chamber. Jon stood, shoulders tense, feeling a weight heavier than any blade he had ever carried. He gazed across the gathered lords, men who had knelt to Targaryens, to Baratheons, to usurpers, men who had endured unspeakable horrors in recent memory. The realm was weary, battered. He thought of the promises he had made to himself never to seek power, never to wear a crown. Yet here he was, for the sake of protecting the living. Gendry stood beside him, looking equally overwhelmed. They exchanged a small nod. In that moment, the chamber erupted in cheering or at least in polite applause from those who assented. Some lords simply nodded stoically, accepting the new reality. Outside, in the courtyard, the black and silver and bronze and brown dragons let out echoing cries, as if sensing the collective shift in power. The coronation was not a grand affair of rubies and gold, but rather a practical ceremony held a day later amid the ominous spires of Harrenhal. Jon was crowned with a simple circlet of Valyrian steel, hammered by Gendry's own hand from broken remnants rumored to be from a past sword. Gendry stood at his side, taking an oath to serve as co-ruler and protector, or Hand of the King, though the exact title was less important than the public display of unity. Lords came forth one by one, kneeling or bowing, swearing fealty to the new monarchy. The vow was given with measured caution. They all remembered how quickly alliances could break. But for now, a new era seemed possible. In the aftermath, Jon and Gendry considered their next steps. They would need to ride to King's Landing to secure the capital and the stability of the realm. They would have to ensure the Gold and Crimson Dragon was brought south, or they might choose to maintain one dragon in the north. There were countless decisions to be made. How to rebuild the city, how to incorporate a great council that had real power, how to treat the small folk, how to prevent abuses by regional lords. They both knew the threat of conflict would not vanish simply because of a coronation. But they carried with them a mandate unlike any in recent history. The realm had chosen them, albeit reluctantly, out of fear of dragons, yes, but also out of a hope that their combined bloodlines might unify a fractured land. They prepared a royal progress, traveling with both dragons and a caravan of supplies, heading toward King's Landing. Along the way, they took time to speak with the small folk, distributing bread, promising a better future, listening to grievances. Gendry's common touch won him admirers among the peasants, who often found him more approachable than any typical High Lord. Jon, quieter, exuded a certain gravitas that came from years of leadership in the darkest nights. They formed a complementary pair, each shoring up the other's weaknesses. Their retinue grew with knights and sworn swords who sensed an opportunity for honor or advancement under a new regime. Yet behind every smile was a question. Could they truly succeed where so many others had failed? When they finally entered King's Landing, the city greeted them with both fear and jubilation. 2 dragons winged overhead. Though still young, they cast menacing shadows. Smoke curled from their nostrils. The people rushed to the streets. Some cheered, seeing in Jon and Gendry's arrival the end of the incompetent regency. Others cowered, recalling the day Dragon Queen Daenerys scorched the city. Jon signaled the dragons to circle wide, avoiding the densest populated areas. He did not wish to rule through terror. Once inside the Red Keep, the Regent Council formally surrendered their powers, kneeling before Jon as king. A new small council formed, with representatives from each major region, including old lords and new. Gendry took up a seat at Jon's right hand, effectively co-ruling. They spent hours drafting decrees aimed at rebuilding the city, reforming the tax system, offering relief to war-torn lands, and reining in lords who might stir up rebellion. Still, the challenges were immense. Dorne watched warily from afar, uncertain if they wanted to remain in the realm or break away. The Iron Islands tested the boundaries of their promised freedoms. Some northern lords, uncomfortable with any monarchy, balked at paying taxes to the south. The dragons themselves, now prowling a courtyard adapted for their needs, caused constant logistical headaches and fears among the populace. Yet day by day, small steps were taken toward a more unified Westeros. Jon's gentle approach balanced Gendry's more fiery determination. The Great Council served as a forum where lords could voice complaints without resorting to arms. Bit by bit, the realm began to heal. Weeks later, word arrived that the Gold and Crimson Dragon had recovered enough to attempt its first real flight. Sansa, from Winterfell, sent a raven reporting that the dragon had soared briefly above the battlements, thrilling the townsfolk below. She wrote that the dragon seemed lonely, calling into the sky as if searching for its siblings. Jon and Gendry debated whether to summon it south or allow it to remain in the north. Ultimately, they decided it might be best to show all 3 dragons in the capital, a sign that the monarchy was real and strong. They asked Sansa to dispatch a small group of experienced handlers to guide the Gold and Crimson Dragon south, though the journey would be a delicate operation. Jon trusted Sansa's ability to manage the task, and a part of him longed to see the shy, injured hatchling. He hoped the presence of all 3 dragons would finally solidify their rule. Not long after, a remarkable sight graced the skies above King's Landing. The Gold and Crimson Dragon, still smaller than its siblings, arrived in flight, escorted by a few riders on horseback who kept watch from below. The city erupted in mixed cries of fear and wonder. Citizens rushed to rooftops or windows, pointing as the creature glided down, guided by the calls of its siblings. In a newly adapted courtyard, the black and silver and bronze and brown dragons roared greetings, flapping their wings. When the Gold and Crimson landed awkwardly, scraping a talon against the cobblestone, it seemed anxious, unsure. Jon approached, carefully extending a hand. The dragon recognized him, nuzzling its head against his chest. A brief moment of closeness that reaffirmed Jon's strange bond with these creatures. Gendry, standing beside the black and silver, grinned, relief evident in his eyes. All 3 dragons were reunited in the capital, a living symbol that House Targaryen had returned, but not alone, joined by House Baratheon, forging a union unseen in history. From that day on, the monarchy of Jon and Gendry began to take a more confident stride. They presided over court sessions together, hearing petitions from lords and small folk alike. Jon often took a stern but compassionate approach, mindful of the lessons he had learned at the Wall and beyond. Gendry brought a directness and a sense of justice for the common folk, remembering his own past. The small council, composed of representatives from across the realm, advised on matters of trade, law, and reconstruction. It was no utopia. No single monarchy could undo centuries of regional rivalries and resentments overnight. But it was a start. The dragons, meanwhile, continued to grow. Over the months and years that followed, they learned to fly more confidently. Their flames grew hotter, their roars more thunderous. In response, the monarchy implemented strict rules for their care, mindful of the devastation a single ill-timed flight could cause. Jon, still uneasy about wielding such power, insisted they be used solely for defense against external threats or as deterrents to internal rebellion that might plunge the realm back into bloodshed. Gendry oversaw the forging of new harnesses and protective gear for the dragons, as well as the training of carefully chosen handlers who treated the creatures with respect. The presence of these dragons, no longer a rumor but a fact, kept would-be usurpers at bay. Over time, peace settled more firmly upon the land, broken by occasional skirmishes or border disputes, but never erupting into full-scale war. As the seasons changed and the scars of war began to fade, the people of Westeros slowly adapted to this new reality. They had a monarchy that was neither purely Targaryen nor purely Baratheon, but rather a fusion of both. Jon Snow, once the bastard of Winterfell, once the king in the north, once a man who walked away from power, now wore a crown out of duty rather than ambition. Gendry Baratheon, once a lowly blacksmith's apprentice, once a bastard sold to Melisandre, once a legitimized lord, now helped shape the realm's future from the Iron Throne's side. Their dragons, each embodying a part of Westeros's rebirth, soared above the capital at times, stirring awe instead of terror. In the quiet hours of the evening, after a day of courtly duties or council sessions, Jon and Gendry would sometimes speak privately, remembering the improbable journey that led them here. They recalled the narrow caves in the Frostfangs where they had first found the 3 eggs, half buried in ice and time. They recalled the terror and wonder of seeing them hatch beneath Winterfell. They remembered the great council of Harrenhal, where they had staked everything on a vision of unity. Through it all, they had become closer than allies. They were brothers by circumstance, forging a bond that neither had expected. In their own ways, they honored the legacies of Ned Stark, of Robert Baratheon, of Rhaegar Targaryen, and perhaps even of Daenerys, though her memory was fraught with tragedy. Their rule was far from perfect, but it was stable enough to give the realm a chance to heal. Some years down the line, small folk would tell tales of the day they glimpsed a black and silver dragon circling Harrenhal, or saw the bronze and brown land by the banks of the Blackwater. They would whisper that King Jon was as cold as the northern snows but as just as the old kings of winter, while King Gendry possessed the fury of a storm yet the heart of a commoner. They would speak of how these two men, so different yet so oddly complementary, guided Westeros through a fragile peace after the horrors of war. They would recount the words of House Stark, "Winter is coming," and House Baratheon, "Ours is the fury," and how, together, those warnings of cold and fury were tempered by a sense of duty to protect the living. Children grew up hearing these stories, sometimes not quite believing that men and dragons had once again shaped the fate of the 7 kingdoms. In time, other concerns arose. A successor for Jon and Gendry, the question of whether the realm should remain a strict monarchy or transition to a more elective system, the ever-present threat of external powers from Essos. Yet those concerns did not overshadow the essential fact. Westeros, at least for a span of years, knew an uncommon respite from widespread slaughter. Where once the Targaryen name and the Baratheon name had clashed, they now joined in an uneasy but resolute union. Where once dragons had only brought fire and blood, they now also brought a promise of protection. Where once the realm had suffered endless contention for the Iron Throne, it now found a measure of stability in the strange alliance of 2 men who never sought that throne but claimed it to serve. And so, the quiet chorus of ravens soared across the skies from Winterfell to King's Landing, from Storm's End to the Eyrie, bearing messages of governance, alliances, and small mercies. Farmers brought in harvests without fear of their fields being burned in a new war of succession. The lords of Dorne traded spices and wines freely, testing the edges of this new monarchy. The children in Flea Bottom no longer quaked at the thought of dragonfire, though they still remembered the day the black and silver soared above them. The realm breathed, recovering from its wounds, forging ahead toward whatever future awaited. And in the Red Keep's courtyard, or in the open skies above, the three dragons lived and grew, reminders that even in a land as harsh and war-torn as Westeros, new life, new hope, and new beginnings were always possible. In the weeks and months that followed the dragons' reunion in the courtyard of the Red Keep, a fragile sense of optimism took root in King's Landing and, slowly, in the wider realm. Word spread from merchants and travelers that the new monarchs, King Jon and King Gendry, listened to the common folk. They traveled among the people, heard grievances, and strove to keep the peace. For a land that had suffered so many tyrants, so many broken promises, the notion of two kings who did not desire unbridled power for its own sake was as surprising as it was precarious. Still, not everyone believed in this newfound stability. There were those whose losses were too great to forgive and those whose ambitions still burned brightly in the shadows. In the Red Keep, the presence of three dragons provoked a flurry of interest. Jon had allowed the gold and crimson dragon to recuperate near the eastern walls, where a makeshift enclosure had been constructed. The black and silver and bronze and brown dragons occupied a larger space in the main courtyard, albeit heavily modified to accommodate their growing frames. Workers toiled daily to reinforce stone walls, carve out new archways, and create channels to drain away the refuse of these majestic but demanding creatures. Twice a week, Gendry oversaw the arrival of butchered cattle from the countryside, a huge expense for the royal coffers, but a necessity for keeping the dragons fed. The beasts grew quickly in muscle and wingspan, scorching their feed with small bursts of flame before devouring it. On the ramparts above, guards patrolled with halberds and crossbows. Jon did not trust the city to remain calm if one of the dragons startled a crowd with a sudden roar or swooped too low over the streets. Yet the people's fascination was undeniable. Even from a distance, children craned their necks to see the black silhouette of a dragon perched on a parapet. Beggars in Flea Bottom spoke of seeing the flicker of dragonfire against the night sky, though often these were only rumors. The small council established strict rules for the creature's flight, minimal airborne excursions mostly for exercise and always under watch. The memory of Daenerys Targaryen's assault was still fresh enough to keep both dragons and subjects in a wary dance of acceptance. Beyond the city walls, farmland stretched toward the Crownlands, now patrolled by knights bearing the united sigils of Stark, Targaryen, and Baratheon. They were an unusual sight. White direwolf, three-headed dragon, and black stag on one field of cloth. A new banner that tried to encompass Jon's northern heritage, Gendry's Stormlands claim, and the Targaryen blood that linked them. Most peasants had never seen such a combination and bowed awkwardly, unsure of how to address the men riding under these colors. Within the Red Keep itself, Jon and Gendry worked tirelessly. They spent hours in the throne room, hearing petitions, reassigning land to those displaced by the wars, and attempting to reconcile once-enemy houses. Gendry brought a straightforward sense of fairness to the proceedings. He remembered all too well what it was to be a peasant, to have no name or gold. Jon was quieter, meditative, but he spoke with the gravity of someone who had witnessed the apocalypse in the form of the Night King. Sometimes he paused mid-sentence, as though recalling winter's horrors. That solemnity tempered Gendry's storms of passion, and the two men found a surprising rhythm in governance. Still, not all was smooth. The Iron Islands tested the limits of the freedom promised to them. Their envoys demanded that the monarchy uphold the old bargains they had coerced from previous rulers, including the right to maintain their own fleets for reaving distant coasts. Jon refused outright, insisting that the era of terrorizing the western seas must end if the Ironborn expected to remain part of the Seven Kingdoms. Gendry, who had labored under the constant threat of Lannister soldiers and the Red Woman, found no sympathy for pirates and slavers. The negotiations grew strained. The Ironborn delegates threatened to sail home and declare independence yet again. Jon responded by quietly alluding to the dragons, reminding them that Harren the Black had once believed Harrenhal's massive walls would protect him from dragonfire. The cautionary tale hung over the Ironborn. In the end, they grudgingly accepted a compromise: autonomy in their local governance, but no explicit permission to raid or reave. Relations remained uneasy. An undercurrent of resentment festered, especially among the younger captains who believed they could carve out their own destiny if they cast off the monarchy. Meanwhile, Dorne stood aloof. House Martell, nearly extinguished, had left only distant cousins and lesser lords to speak for the region. They were reluctant to bend the knee to any monarch, even one half-Targaryen by blood, after all that had transpired with Elia Martell and then Oberyn. Yet the idea of dragons in the sky disturbed them enough to send cautious messages. The new leadership in Sunspear spoke of trade. They wanted to exchange spices, wine, and silk for the promise of the monarchy's non-interference. To Jon and Gendry, forging economic ties seemed a sensible step. Over time, they hoped a genuine alliance might flourish, or at least a peaceful coexistence. Amid these political tangles, the black and silver dragon, largest and boldest, continued to test its boundaries. It often paced the courtyard, tail lashing, wings flaring in the sunlight. Maesters and handlers worked diligently to keep it calm, feeding it on a strict schedule. Yet more than once, a spout of flame singed a stable roof, forcing repairs. The bronze and brown dragon, though calmer, grew possessive of its territory, hissing whenever unfamiliar guards approached. The gold and crimson one, smallest but swiftest, recovered its confidence after the wing injury healed. It climbed onto ramparts, gliding short distances with more grace than either sibling. A hush would fall across the city whenever one of these scaled silhouettes passed overhead. Some saw the dragons as omens of a new golden age. Others trembled, recalling the Mad King's final days and Daenerys's fiery wrath. Gendry, for his part, maintained a personal forge within the Red Keep's grounds. When not presiding over court, he could be found hammering out nails, fittings, and occasionally intricate pieces for harnesses or bridles. He claimed it helped him think. The clang of metal on metal, the glow of coals, these were as familiar to him as the Storm's End battlements had once been to Robert Baratheon. He enjoyed forging gifts for the household staff who had served loyally through the realm's turmoil, be it a new pot for the castle cook or a decorative piece for a steward's belt. By forging, he remained grounded, remembering that kingship was not just about words in a hall, but about the tangible, everyday lives of their subjects. Jon, on the other hand, struggled to adapt to courtly life. Once, he might have found respite in the Godswood, the quiet presence of a heart tree. But King's Landing had no weirwood. Its gardens offered roses, not the austere hush of northern groves. He took to pacing along the Red Keep's battlements at dawn, looking eastward where the sun rose over Blackwater Bay. There, he would recall the final battle against the Night King, the chaotic storm of ice and death at Winterfell, the hiss of dragonglass in the darkness. Sometimes, he questioned if the living realm would ever truly be at peace or if they simply traded one fear for another. Yet each sunrise, he resolved to do what he must. He had accepted the crown not for glory but because he believed, in some quiet corner of his heart, that a stable monarchy could protect the people from another cataclysmic horror. Days lengthened into weeks. Envoys came and went from across Westeros, bringing wedding proposals, trade agreements, disputes about land. Jon and Gendry quickly discovered that half the conflicts in the realm arose from petty lords trying to expand their domains. Every now and then, the Great Council formed after Harrenhal was reconvened in a smaller session, a kind of royal moot, where delegates from each region would gather to vote on pressing issues. Though it slowed decision-making, it also defused potential rebellions. Those lords who chafed at being ruled by two reluctant kings found they could air their grievances in a structured environment, forging alliances or voting blocks rather than taking up arms. Bit by bit, a shaky foundation for representative governance began to form. Some said it was a clumsy experiment destined to fail. Others believed it heralded a new era of compromise. In the midst of all this, the gold and crimson dragon took flight one evening without warning. It soared over the city, drifting on warm air currents. Soldiers along the walls panicked, blowing horns and readying crossbows, fearful of another rain of fire. People in the streets ducked behind walls or fled indoors, screaming about a returning dragon queen. But the gold and crimson only circled lazily, letting out a series of high-pitched calls, as if exploring the city's skies for the first time. Jon hastened to climb onto the highest tower, calling it back in a calm voice. Eventually, it descended, perching on a spire near him. The wind whipped Jon's cloak as he extended a hand. The dragon sniffed at his fingers, then allowed him to hold its gaze. In that moment, watchers from the courtyard and from the distant windows saw a man and a young dragon regarding each other with an almost intimate connection. The city's fear subsided into a trembling hush. A few in the streets even cheered. Others dropped to their knees, praying. The gold and crimson dragon soon took off again, but this time it flew toward the courtyard, settling beside its siblings. King's Landing breathed again. Such displays, though potentially frightening, also solidified the image that these dragons were not here to burn the realm but to protect it, or at least to guard the new monarchy. When the next round of rebellious talk emerged from the Vale or the Reach, more moderate lords quickly quelled it, reminding firebrands that the monarchy's power was backed by living, growing dragons. That knowledge kept a precarious peace in place, even as resentments simmered. Not long after, Jon received word from Sansa in Winterfell. She wrote that the North was beginning to recover from the devastation of the Long Night, but it needed more resources. New farmland seeds, blacksmiths to replace lost arms, and stonemasons for repairs. She appealed to her brother for better trade routes, wanting northern ports to open to southern traders. With the monarchy's backing, such a plan could flourish, bringing wealth and prosperity to the North for the first time in generations. Jon read the letter privately, his chest tightening with both pride and concern. He wanted to help Sansa, to see the North thrive. Yet many southern lords scoffed at investing coin in the cold lands above the neck. Gendry, upon hearing this, recalled how Storm's End had once been considered a backwater in need of ships and infrastructure. He pledged support for Sansa's initiative. Together, the two kings pushed the matter in the small council, arguing that strengthening the North would strengthen the realm as a whole. Over weeks of debate, with some concessions of tax breaks here and there, the measure passed. Ships soon sailed to White Harbor, carrying building materials, seeds, and craftsmen, paid for by the royal treasury. In return, the North promised shipments of timber, furs, and silver ore from its mines. A new wave of communication and commerce began bridging the old southern-northern divide. Such positive developments, however, did not erase the kingdom's deeper fault lines. Rumors of discontent flourished in taverns and back alleys. Some said the monarchy was too soft, that with dragons at their disposal, Jon and Gendry should stamp out all opposition rather than negotiate. Others said the monarchy was too harsh, using dragons as intimidation while claiming benevolence. Street corner prophets raved about a second coming of the Long Night or the possibility of a foreign invasion from Essos, emboldened by the realm's internal fractures. Sailors' tales from the narrow sea mentioned strange sightings, fleets of unknown origin lurking near distant coasts, perhaps from the free cities or beyond. To learn more, Gendry dispatched loyal agents to gather intelligence in Bravos, Pentos, and Volantis. Some of these agents returned with worrisome stories. Mercenary companies were on the move, the free cities once again in flux as lords and magisters sought power. There were whispers that certain factions might hunger for dragons of their own, or at least fear the resurgence of Targaryen might in Westeros. One rumor claimed that Sellswords had tried to hunt dragon eggs, rumored to lie hidden in the Shadowlands. Another rumor insisted that a red-robed priestess was preaching that the prince that was promised had not yet fulfilled his destiny, and that fire and blood would again sweep across the world. These scattered tales made Jon uneasy. He recalled how the Red Woman, Melisandre, had once looked at him with a fervent glint in her eyes, calling him the Chosen One. Though Jon wanted no part in prophecy, he knew such beliefs could stir dangerous actions. In King's Landing, the days pressed on. The monarchy's administration expanded, with new scribes, new accountants, new captains of the guard. Jon insisted on thorough record-keeping, wanting transparency. Gendry took charge of forging and distributing new coinage bearing the combined sigils. A stag and a wolf around the perimeter of a three-headed dragon. The design caused debate. Some wanted only the dragon to symbolize Targaryen legitimacy. Others wanted a crown stag and a dire wolf with no dragon at all. In the end, they settled on a subtle melding of all three. When the first coins were minted, Gendry personally inspected them in his workshop. He held one up to the light, seeing the hammered outlines. It was a small thing, a piece of metal that would trade hands among peasants, merchants, and knights, but it represented something bigger. A new era, hopefully more stable than the last. The young dragons, now nearing the size of large horses, often tested their boundaries. The black and silver one had grown fiercely protective of its territory, snarling at any approach that was not accompanied by either Jon or Gendry. The courtyard gates needed constant guard, for a single flap of the creature's wings could send a man flying or crush him against a wall. Jon began experimenting with the idea of flight for himself. He recalled how Daenerys had ridden her dragons into battle. The notion terrified him. He had seen what a fall from a dragon's back could do, but he also recognized the necessity. If these dragons were truly to be defenders of the realm, they needed to be comfortable with riders guiding them. Gendry, equally determined, insisted that he train as well. He had seen how flight changed the course of a battle. Perhaps, he said, if both kings learned to ride, the realm would see them as protectors from the skies, not a single man with unstoppable power. Cautiously, they worked with the black and silver, the largest. Its attitude was at once proud and suspicious. Jon spent hours each morning stroking its scaled flank, speaking to it in soothing tones, offering it choice cuts of venison. Gendry would approach from the opposite side, letting the dragon sniff his scent, feeling its hot breath on his arms. Step by step, they guided it to accept a harness. There were tense moments. A whip of its tail once knocked Jon flat, bruising his ribs. Another time, the dragon let out a roar that sent Gendry stumbling back, nearly singeing his eyebrows. But the process advanced. At last, the day came when Jon, wearing leathers and carrying minimal gear, climbed onto the black and silver's back. A hush fell over the courtyard as onlookers, from guards to stable hands, watched. Gendry stood ready, heart pounding. The dragon shifted uneasily, wings twitching, but it did not thrash Jon off. With a soft command, Jon coaxed it forward. The dragon took a few awkward steps, then half-jumped, its wings flapping. Dust blew across the yard, and the watchers shouted in awe as the beast rose a few feet, then landed again with a heavy thud. Jon held on, grimacing as the jolt went through his body. Sweat trickled down his temples. But they had done it. A brief taste of flight. Over the next weeks, they repeated the exercise. Sometimes the black and silver refused to comply, hissing and snapping. Other times, it took off for short glides, with Jon clinging to the harness as if his life depended on it. Gendry took his turn as well, though he was heavier and less graceful in the saddle. He found it both exhilarating and terrifying to feel the power of the dragon's muscles beneath him, to sense the rush of air and the swirl of dust. The bronze and brown dragon watched these lessons with a kind of docile curiosity, as if waiting its turn, while the gold and crimson perched on ramparts or slunk around the edges of the yard, occasionally letting out a soft croon. The small council had mixed opinions on these riding lessons. Some thought it wise that both kings learn to control the beasts, while others worried about accidents or the potential for the dragons to turn on their riders if startled. Yet word spread beyond the castle walls that the two kings were taming dragons in earnest. To the small folk, it became another piece of evidence that the monarchy possessed power yet did not use it to unleash terror. From the Vale to the Stormlands, from the Reach to the Westerlands, lords took note. A few who had wavered in their loyalty began to reaffirm ties, sending gifts to King's Landing. On the other hand, certain schemers found fresh cause for alarm. If both kings became skilled dragon riders, who would dare oppose them? In time, a new threat bubbled to the surface from the southwestern coasts. Reports arrived of small fleets under black sails raiding fishing villages. Some said these were iron-born marauders ignoring the monarchy's edicts. Others whispered of pirates from the Stepstones or mercenaries from Lys. Refugees fleeing these attacks clogged the roads leading to King's Landing, seeking royal protection. Jon and Gendry convened the council to discuss dispatching the Royal Navy. Yet the battered fleet left from the recent wars was barely sufficient to patrol Blackwater Bay. The monarchy had not yet fully restored the once proud Targaryen or Baratheon navies. Lords from the Reach offered minimal help, barely a handful of ships. House Valerion of Driftmark, though historically allied with Targaryens, had been weakened by the wars. They promised support but also needed resources to repair their own vessels. Torn between these conflicting needs, Jon and Gendry decided on a bold step. They would sail in person with a modest fleet to assess the threat on the southwestern shores, hoping their presence might rally local lords to action. The small council balked at the idea of both monarchs leaving King's Landing. What if the city faced sabotage? But Gendry argued that a show of leadership would inspire loyalty, while Jon pointed out that they could not govern effectively if they hid behind walls. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Sirs Brienne of Tarth and Davos Seaworth would remain behind to safeguard the capital as the monarchy's representatives, while Jon and Gendry led an expedition to the southwestern coast with enough knights to keep them safe. Of course, the question of what to do with the dragons arose. Were they to be left behind or brought along by land or sea? Jon worried that traveling with dragons on ships might be dangerous. There was no guarantee the creatures would remain calm during the voyage. Gendry suggested they take at least one dragon, perhaps the black and silver, by flying along the coastline, while the ships sailed below. That way, the mere sight of a dragon overhead could deter pirates. But the black and silver was still not fully grown or fully accustomed to long flights carrying a rider. After many debates, they decided on a partial measure. The gold and crimson, being the most agile, would accompany them in flight without a rider, free to scout from above, while the black and silver and bronze and brown remained at King's Landing with experienced handlers. If trouble arose, ravens could summon the other two dragons quickly. Sansa might also send for them from Winterfell if the north needed aerial protection. So it was that Jon, Gendry, and a retinue of 300 soldiers, along with a dozen ships of various sizes, set sail from Blackwater Bay. The gold and crimson dragon circled overhead like a fiery kite, drawing gasps from sailors and watchers on the shore. The vessel carrying Jon and Gendry led the fleet, bearing the triple sigil banner. Seawater sprayed the sides as they navigated the calmer summer waves. Gendry took to the decks naturally, recalling the boat he had once rowed away from Dragonstone. Jon was more solemn, watching the horizon for any sign of trouble. Occasionally, the gold and crimson would vanish into a cloud bank, only to reappear an hour later, screeching a greeting and gliding alongside the masts. When they reached the southwestern coasts, they found devastation in the fishing villages. Burned huts, battered docks, bodies left in the ruins. Survivors huddled in makeshift camps, terrified to rebuild, claiming that the raiders came every fortnight. Jon and Gendry split their forces to secure the nearby port towns and to question witnesses. The survivors gave conflicting accounts. Some swore the raiders flew sigils of a kraken, suggesting Ironborn. Others claimed to see foreign cell sails speaking in accents from across the narrow sea. A pattern emerged, though. The raiders seemed well organized, hitting a village quickly, taking gold, supplies, and captives, then disappearing back to the sea. It was not random pillaging. They took minimal losses each time, suggesting leadership that was cunning and strategic. Seeking answers, Jon rode inland to visit a local minor lord, one Lord Redwine of a lesser branch related to the Arbor. He found the castle partly in ruins, with the lord having mustered what men he could. Lord Redwine recounted how his coastlines were under constant threat, and his requests for help from Highgarden had fallen on deaf ears. The lord was wary of the monarchy, given the uncertain alliances with the Tyrell holdouts. Still, he greeted Jon with reluctant respect, guiding him through blackened corridors that smelled of smoke and salt. Jon listened carefully, learning that the raiders had advanced knowledge of each village's defenses, striking at times of vulnerability. That pointed to infiltration or local informants. Meanwhile, Gendry coordinated repairs to the battered docks in the main harbor, forging alliances with local merchants who had lost everything. He oversaw the unloading of building supplies, promising to help them rebuild if they pledged their loyalty to the crown's laws. Many looked on with distrust. Kings had come and gone, leaving their land in ashes. But Gendry's approachable manner, reminiscent of a blacksmith rather than a distant lord, gradually put them at ease. When the gold and crimson dragon made an unexpected landing on the dunes near the harbor, the people scattered in alarm. But Gendry walked over, fed the dragon a cut of salted beef, and let it settle in the sand, flicking its spiky tail. Seeing the king calmly handle such a terrifying creature reassured some villagers that perhaps these new monarchs were different from the tyrants of old. Together, Jon and Gendry arranged a plan to patrol the coastline with their ships, using the dragon as an airborne scout. For several nights, they sailed up and down the waters, while the gold and crimson soared overhead. The watchers on the ships carried torches and horns, ready to alert the main force if they spotted sails in the moonlight. The first few nights yielded nothing, just black, rolling waves and the lonely cries of gulls. The men began to grow restless, suspecting that the raiders had moved on. Then, on the fourth night, the horns blared. A lookout had spotted dark ships approaching a small cove where a fishing hamlet lay half rebuilt. Jon and Gendry quickly rallied their men. The gold and crimson, responding to the horns, swooped low to investigate, sending plumes of water spraying with each wing beat. Torchlight reflected off its crimson scales. In the dim starlight, they saw 5 ships, black sails furled. Figures scurried across the decks, readying grapnels to drag boats onto the beach. Jon's ship led the charge, cutting through the waves, while Gendry barked orders to the archers. Arrows rained from the monarchy's vessels, some tipped with wildfire potions that Gendry had prepared, a trick he had learned from the old war. Meanwhile, the gold and crimson soared overhead, letting out shrill cries. The invaders, caught off guard, tried to launch a barrage of arrows at the dragon, but the darkness and confusion hampered their aim. One arrow grazed the dragon's flank, eliciting a furious roar and a small gout of flame. The scene erupted in chaos, flickering greenish flames from the wildfire mixing with the red glow of the dragon's breath. As Jon's ship pulled alongside the nearest raider vessel, men boarded with grappling hooks. A fierce melee ensued on the slippery decks, steel clashing. Jon, wielding Longclaw, cut through a knot of defenders. He glimpsed foreign mercenaries, some with Associ tattoos, some in ragged ironborn leathers, fighting side by side. This was no single faction but a mixed crew of desperate men. Gendry led another boarding party on a second vessel, using his hammer with bone-rattling force. A memory flashed in his mind. The Battle of Winterfell, the screech of the dead. Here, at least, the enemy was living flesh and blood. Overhead, the dragon roared again, diving low enough that the flapping of its wings battered the raiders' ships, scattering crates and men like leaves. By the time dawn broke, the monarchy's forces had seized or sunk all 5 raider ships. The beach was littered with bodies, some half-burned by wildfire or the dragon's breath. Survivors were corralled onto the sand, forced to kneel. Exhausted soldiers raised their swords in a victory cry. Gendry, panting, joined Jon in confronting the captured raiders. Their ragtag leader, a scarred man with a shaved head, spat blood and curses. Under threat of a beheading, he revealed they were part of a larger group, a mercenary fleet called the Tide Lions, funded by unknown backers in Essos. They were promised gold, plunder, and slaves if they kept the southwestern coasts weak. The man refused to name who had hired them, only sneering that more ships would come. Jon's gaze darkened. He ordered the survivors bound and locked in the holds of the monarchy's ships. A trial would follow, but first the realm needed answers. The coastal hamlet's people, roused by the commotion, emerged to see the captured raiders, the gold and crimson dragon standing sentinel on the beach with smoke drifting from its maw. Some villagers trembled at the sight of the beast, but others whispered prayers of thanks. For the moment, the monarchy had delivered them from another night of terror. With the immediate threat quelled, Jon and Gendry directed the men to search the captured ships. They found stolen goods from multiple villages, broken crates of dried fish, barrels of stolen ale, and iron chains used to shackle captives. The men also discovered cryptic letters in an unfamiliar script, perhaps High Valyrian or an Essosi dialect. Jon handed these to a maester traveling with them, hoping the texts might reveal the identity of the raiders' paymasters. After days spent interrogating prisoners and helping the hamlet rebuild, Jon and Gendry led the fleet southward to the next coastline. They moved cautiously, the gold and crimson dragon scouting from above. They found more signs of raids, burned huts, rotted piers, but no immediate presence of the tide lions. Some fishermen, half-crazed with fear, insisted that the raiders vanished back east, toward Essos. With limited resources, Jon and Gendry could not chase them across the sea. Instead, they focused on fortifying the southwestern coasts. Gendry oversaw the repair and expansion of watchtowers, forging deals with local lords to staff them. Jon worked on installing a Warden of the Southwest, a new position akin to the Warden of the North or East, to unify local defenses. He had to tread carefully, not wanting to alienate the Tyrell loyalists who still considered the Reach their domain. But necessity demanded action. Weeks passed in this manner, each day bringing new challenges. The gold and crimson dragon grew increasingly comfortable flying long distances over the sea, sometimes chasing flocks of gulls or drifting with the ocean breeze. At night, it roosted near the monarchy's flagship, perched on a rocky outcrop or on the beach, eyes glittering. Though never entirely tame, it seemed to respond to both Jon and Gendry's calm presence, occasionally letting them touch its snout or feed it scraps. The captured mercenaries remained tight-lipped beyond what they had already revealed. The monarchy's forces hanged a few ringleaders after a swift tribunal for their crimes of murder and raiding. The rest were placed in shackles, destined for the dungeons in King's Landing until the monarchy decided their fate. Eventually, satisfied that the southwestern coasts were in no immediate danger, Jon and Gendry led the fleet back to King's Landing. Their arrival was met with fanfare. News had spread that the monarchy had successfully fended off another threat. Crowds gathered along the docks, cheering or silently watching as the gold and crimson dragon soared overhead. The city's mood lifted, if only slightly. The presence of raiders had proven that the realm was still vulnerable, but it also showed that the monarchy could respond decisively. Some lords murmured that this was exactly the kind of leadership Westeros needed, strength balanced by caution. Others grumbled about the cost of sending so many resources to the southwestern shores when other regions also needed help. Upon returning to the Red Keep, Jon and Gendry were informed that letters had arrived from multiple corners of the realm. Sansa wrote that the North's development continued apace, though the onset of a harsh autumn threatened the harvest. Brienne and Davos reported that King's Landing had remained quiet in their absence, though tensions were high in the Stormlands. A certain Lord Grandison was stirring talk against Gendry, claiming that Storm's End should belong to a pure-blooded Baratheon. Yet, as far as Jon and Gendry knew, Gendry was the last living Baratheon recognized by royal decree. The rumor of a hidden Baratheon heir or distant cousin sounded far-fetched, but it merited investigation. Gendry's expression hardened. He would not easily surrender Storm's End after all he had endured. More troubling was a missive from the maesters analyzing the seized documents from the Tide Lions ships. They concluded that the texts were in a dialect of High Valyrian used in certain freeholds of Essos. The content hinted at instructions to create chaos in Westeros, specifically targeting regions that were historically loyal to Targaryens or Baratheons. Large sums of gold were promised upon successful completion of raids. The letters were signed only with a symbol resembling a twisted dragon's head, not any known noble crest. None of the maesters could definitively identify which magister or faction in Essos might be behind it. But the message was clear. Some force across the sea wanted to destabilize the monarchy before it could grow too strong, and they were willing to pay mercenaries to do so. The question was, why? Jon, pacing in the small council chamber, read the translated lines of the documents over and over, as though he might glean some hidden clue. He remembered that House Targaryen had originated in Old Valyria. He remembered stories of splinter groups, so-called lesser freeholds, scattered after the Doom. It was possible that an obscure line of Targaryens or a cult of Valyrian loyalists might resent the monarchy in Westeros. They might see Jon as an unworthy Targaryen, or perhaps they simply feared the reemergence of dragons that might one day threaten them. Or it could be mercenary politics. Gendry, more direct in his assessment, suggested that some wealthy Essosi lords saw profit in a divided Westeros, easier to exploit for trade routes or resources. The truth remained elusive. Amid these concerns, the black and silver and bronze and brown dragons greeted the gold and crimson with excited roars when it returned to the courtyard. The three creatures sniffed and nipped at each other, exchanging guttural calls that reverberated off the castle walls. Their bond seemed to have grown stronger with time. Even so, the black and silver displayed subtle signs of dominance, flaring its wings and snapping when the gold and crimson ventured too close to a favored feeding spot. Handlers had to stay vigilant, ensuring no fierce fights broke out. Jon and Gendry knew that as the dragons matured, they might grow more territorial. Balancing that wild nature with the realm's safety would only become more challenging. One evening, after a lengthy council session, Jon retreated to his private chambers. He had scarcely removed his cloak when there was a knock at the door. Gendry entered, looking weary but determined. He held a small piece of parchment. "Another letter from the southwestern coasts," he said quietly. "Lord Redwine says the raids have paused, but smugglers claim more ships are gathering in secret coves. He thinks a second wave is coming soon, and we've barely had time to rest." Jon rubbed his temples, the weight of the crown bearing down on him. "We can't be in two places at once," he said. "And if they're from Essos, these Tide Lions or whoever leads them might attack any vulnerable coastline. The realm is too large. Even with dragons, we can't guard every port." Gendry nodded. "We need a different approach. Maybe more alliances. We can't just chase them one raid at a time. If we knew exactly where they're coming from, or who is paying them." "I know," Jon replied softly. "I'm looking into the old Targaryen ties in the east. Perhaps there's some clue in the archives about who might hold a grudge or a claim. But it's a labyrinth of history, and the Valyrian freehold was destroyed long ago. We might be dealing with a shadow group we know nothing about. Maybe it's time we put out some bounties on them," Gendry suggested. "Encourage rival mercenary companies in Essos to hunt these Tide Lions down. Gold can turn any sell's word. If we can't unite the realm against them directly, we can at least buy ourselves some time." Jon exhaled. He did not like the idea of funneling gold into more violence, but he saw the logic. "We'll present it to the council. See if we can set aside a portion of the treasury as a bounty." They spoke for a while longer, discussing how to keep the realm from fracturing under external pressure. Each recognized they would need to rely on allies in the Great Council to pass new taxes or muster more ships. That, in turn, could stir resentment among the lords who despised centralized rule. Another balancing act awaited them. Beyond the political challenges, life in the capital continued with an odd sense of normalcy. Markets bustled, street performers enticed crowds, and taverns filled with rumor and gossip. People told tales of the southwestern raids, of the monarchy's victory on the beaches, and of the possibility that foreign fleets lurked just out of sight, waiting to strike. Some insisted that the monarchy's dragons would incinerate any threat. Others argued that 3 dragons, still not full-grown, could not defend every shore. Whispers of a hidden true Baratheon or a lost Targaryen scion circulated among conspiracy theorists. Jon and Gendry had become the talk of the realm, with small folk painting them as everything from wise rulers to walking tragedies, from heroic saviors to future tyrants. In the midst of these swirling stories, the monarchy discovered a chance to cement alliances through more personal ties. Lady Asha Greyjoy, still a force among the Ironborn, arrived in King's Landing with a modest entourage. She requested an audience to discuss the future of the Iron Islands under the monarchy. Many in court remembered her role in the War of the Five Kings. She was blunt, clever, and fiercely protective of Ironborn interests. Jon and Gendry met her in the throne room. She eyed the dragons in the courtyard with a mix of defiance and pragmatic caution. Over several tense meetings, the monarchy negotiated new terms of Ironborn autonomy. No more open raiding of Westerosi shores, acceptance of the monarchy's overlordship, and in return they would have the freedom to govern themselves internally under Asha's leadership. The negotiations almost broke down more than once, but the looming threat of Dragonfire, and perhaps genuine respect for Jon and Gendry's fairness, pushed her to compromise. When she departed, a new understanding had been forged. The Iron Islands would remain part of the Seven Kingdoms in name, but with wide latitude to manage their own affairs, provided they did not disrupt the wider realm. Only time would tell if this uneasy truce would hold. A similar approach was attempted with Dorne. Envoys from Sunspear arrived, led by a distant cousin of the Martells, a cautious man named Lord Lucero. His demands were simpler: maintain Dorne's right to govern its own traditions and laws, especially regarding inheritance and the role of women in leadership. Jon and Gendry agreed readily, having no desire to stifle Dorne's customs. In return, Dorne pledged to supply the monarchy with cavalry and archers if any foreign threat attempted an invasion. Lucero also hinted that some in Dorne were intrigued by the presence of dragons. Memories of past Targaryen marriages with Martell princesses lingered in the dusty annals of history. Perhaps a marital alliance might be arranged in the future, he suggested. Jon, who had grown weary of the politics of marriage after all he had seen, let the matter drop. Gendry, though open-minded, also did not relish the idea of forging an arranged marriage just for political gain. For now, they left the notion on the table without promising anything. During these months, the black and silver dragon surpassed its siblings in size. Its wingspan, once unwieldy, now gave it a commanding presence whenever it rose into the air. It often perched atop the Red Keep's highest spire, surveying the city below with a regal posture reminiscent of a perched eagle. The bronze and brown favored the lower ramparts, sunning itself lazily, as if unbothered by the hustle of the capital. The gold and crimson, swift and graceful, flew circuits around the city at dawn or dusk, returning to the courtyard with raucous cries. The monarchy's bond with these creatures deepened, but so did the challenges of housing them. Parts of the keep's walls needed constant reinforcement. The feeding demands drained resources. Many in the small council muttered that the monarchy should find an open space outside the city to raise the dragons. Yet the question remained: where? No place was truly safe, and if an enemy wanted to sabotage or poison the dragons, it would be easier if they were sequestered far from the watchful eyes of the Red Keep. One autumn afternoon, a royal progress was organized to allow the small folk a chance to see their rulers more closely and to receive boons or judgments in a more personal manner. Jon and Gendry rode together on horseback, flanked by guards. Crowds pressed along the streets. Children perched on walls, hoping for a glimpse of the kings. Vendors sold hot pies and roasted nuts. Musicians tried to drown each other out. People cheered or pressed forward with petitions. Jon listened intently to each request for help, whether it was a widow seeking justice for her stolen goat or a merchant complaining about road tolls. Gendry, though less polished, also dismounted at times to talk directly with blacksmiths or street urchins, handing out small coins. The monarchy's willingness to mingle with ordinary folk earned warm appreciation from some corners, while aristocrats scoffed at such unseemly displays. Yet both kings found that hearing real voices and seeing real faces reminded them why they had taken this burden in the first place. That evening, as they returned to the Red Keep, the gold and crimson dragon soared overhead, letting out a triumphant screech. The sight of its scarlet wings against the autumn sky was breathtaking. Some small folk pointed upward, exclaiming in awe, no longer fleeing in terror as they once might have. With time, they had come to see the dragons more as guardians than as harbingers of doom. Of course, older citizens who remembered the day King's Landing burned still shuddered at any sign of flame. But hope, albeit fragile, was a powerful thing. It could shift perceptions as surely as the turning of the seasons. Yet for all the monarchy's successes, shadows lay on the horizon. Intelligence from Essos remained murky. With no clear sign of who was funding raids or whether a larger invasion might loom. Rumors of a hidden true Baratheon or lost Targaryen surfaced again, fueled by unscrupulous lords who believed they might manipulate a new puppet claimant. In the Riverlands, brigands had begun terrorizing remote hamlets, possibly ex-soldiers who refused to lay down arms. In the Vale, young Lord Robert Arryn, now of age, bristled at the monarchy's authority, egged on by certain ambitious knights. The great council meetings turned heated, sometimes devolving into shouting matches over taxes, trade policies, and the monarchy's right to command local levies. Through it all, Jon and Gendry tried to maintain their unity. They attended each council session together, presenting a single front. Differences arose. Jon often favored compromise and caution, while Gendry sometimes advocated a direct, forceful stance. But they had learned to temper each other's extremes. On rare occasions, they argued in private, voices echoing in the halls of the Red Keep. Yet the next day, they would stand side by side again, remembering the bigger picture. The realm needed stability. They had found 3 dragon eggs in the Frostfangs, and from that improbable discovery, they had forged a new era. Neither intended to let it crumble. As winter approached, the monarchy organized a grand feast in the Red Keep to celebrate the harvest and the slow rebuilding of King's Landing. Lords and ladies from across Westeros, even from Dorne and the Iron Islands, arrived in fine apparel, crowding into the refurbished throne room. Musicians played lively tunes, and a lavish spread of roasted game, bread, and spiced wine filled the tables. The 3 dragons did not attend, of course, but their presence loomed in everyone's mind. Toasts were made to the Dragon Kings, to the memory of those lost in past wars, and to the forging of a new path. Jon, dressed in modest finery, offered a humble speech about unity and survival. Gendry lifted a goblet of wine, raising a cheer for the hard-working small folk who had borne the brunt of every conflict. The hall echoed with applause, at least outwardly. Behind the applause, subplots simmered. Alliances were reaffirmed or broken with a handshake or a whispered vow. Eyes flicked toward the monarchy, measuring them for advantage. It was during this feast that an unexpected visitor arrived. A robed figure, announcing himself as a humble scholar from Old Town, gained entry to the keep with a letter of introduction from Archmaester Rinwell. He asked for a private audience with the kings. Suspicious but curious, Jon and Gendry met him in a side chamber guarded by 2 knights. The scholar introduced himself as Maester Aloy, a historian of Valyrian heritage who had studied lost texts about dragons and Targaryen bloodlines. He claimed to have uncovered a reference to a secret lineage in Essos, possibly connected to the old Targaryen houses that fled Valyria before the Doom. He believed that the recent raids might be instigated by a covert group known as the Red Dragon Scions, who saw Westeros's monarchy as a threat to their own claim to ancient Valyrian power. Aloy's hands trembled as he showed them a copy of an ancient scroll, lines in High Valyrian referencing a secret flame that would one day reclaim the throne of the conquerors. He had traced the symbol on the scroll, a twisted dragon's head, matching the mark found in the Tide Lion's instructions. Jon and Gendry exchanged uneasy looks. If this was true, they might be facing more than mercenary raids. They might be contending with a hidden faction that believed it had a right, or a destiny, to rule Westeros through the old Valyrian lineage. Maester Aloy admitted that his sources were incomplete. The Red Dragon Scions might have no real power or might be only a handful of fanatics. Alternatively, they might command vast wealth and armies across the free cities. No one knew for sure. He had risked his life bringing this information, hoping to warn the monarchy before it was too late. Jon thanked him gravely, promising to consult the official archives and share the findings with the small council. Gendry asked if there were any direct leads they could follow. Aloy shook his head, saying that if the Scions wanted secrecy, they would remain hidden behind proxies like the Tide Lions. Only a concerted effort across the narrow sea might root them out. But that would require more alliances or a strong navy to project power. Alternatively, it might require forging a treaty. Could the monarchy negotiate with these would-be heirs of Valyria? The possibilities churned in Jon's mind. That evening, long after the feast ended, he stood on a balcony overlooking the city's rooftops. A cold wind tugged at his cloak. Below, torchlights glimmered in twisting alleys. Beyond, The waters of Blackwater Bay reflected a crescent moon. He thought of how easily a war could start. Just one spark among all this tinder. The dragons might protect Westeros from invasion, but they could not stamp out secret intrigues across the sea. And what if the Red Dragon Scions truly believed in their own right to rule, their own prophecy? Another Targaryen faction rising might tear the realm apart, overshadowing the fragile unity he and Gendry had built. He did not hear Gendry approach until the taller man stood by his side, arms folded against the chill. They said nothing at first, just gazed out at the city that both belonged to them and seemed so distant. After a moment, Gendry asked, "Do you regret it? Taking the crown?" Jon considered. Part of him did, truth be told. He missed the North's quiet forests, the sense of belonging in a simpler life. But the wars had taken so much from everyone. He sighed. "Sometimes, but we did what we had to. It isn't about what we want." Gendry nodded. I'd rather be in a forge than a throne room, if I'm honest. But I suppose forging a realm is not so different from forging steel. You heat it, hammer it, shape it. Sometimes it cracks. Then you start over. Jon's gaze flicked to a faint silhouette in the sky, a dragon's shape, gliding in the moonlight. He recognized the gold and crimson from its narrower form. The creature circled the city as if keeping watch. "We'll keep trying," he said. "We have to." They remained there for a while, silent, each weighed down by thoughts of external threats and internal rifts. Behind them, the Red Keep's corridors echoed with the faint strains of music from the feast, the laughter of courtiers who might be dancing away the night, unconcerned with what the future held. But the monarchy had no such luxury. They were the ones who stood at the crossroads, with the realm's fate in their hands. Somewhere in the dark, foreign powers conspired, discontented lords plotted, and a new generation of subjects pinned their hopes on the promise of peace. Every choice Jon and Gendry made rippled across the land, shaping destinies they could scarcely predict. When dawn arrived, they summoned the small council, including Maester Aloy, to present the findings about the Red Dragon Scions. Predictably, the reaction was one of alarm and skepticism. Some council members insisted it was nonsense, the ravings of exiled Targaryen loyalists with no real power. Others demanded an immediate show of force across the narrow sea, an unfeasible proposal, given the realm's limited naval strength. A few suggested reaching out to the free cities for diplomatic talks, though none could say which city or faction to contact. Jon and Gendry concluded that they needed more information before taking drastic steps. They authorized Maester Aloy to return to Old Town with additional resources, searching for any references to these scions in ancient Valyrian records. They also tasked a few trusted envoys, chosen for their subtlety, to travel to Bravos and Pentos, quietly investigating any whisper of large payments or covert gatherings related to the Twisted Dragon sigil. Felt inadequate, but it was a start. That same day, as the city stirred beneath the rising sun, the dragons awakened in the courtyard, stretching their wings with reptilian yawns. A new day meant new tasks. More petitions, more letters, more attempts to bind together a fractured land. The monarchy's retinue bustled with purpose, knights strapping on armor, scribes collecting sheaves of parchment, stewards arranging the day's audiences. In the midst of it all, Jon and Gendry prepared themselves for another day of balancing alliances, addressing grievances, and planning for threats they could scarcely see. Though their shoulders felt heavy, neither would shirk the duty they had taken upon themselves. Sometimes, when the burden grew too great, they only had to look at the dragons, living proof that out of dire circumstances, something wondrous and powerful could be born. And so the monarchy endured, forging ahead through uncertainty. The realm had survived the long night, the wrath of Cersei, the fury of Daenerys. Now it faced a more subtle danger, the slow unraveling of stability if the monarchy faltered. Yet in the hearts of many small folk, a fresh hope flickered, a belief that two kings, each bearing half the weight of the crown, each shaping policy with different eyes, might weave a tapestry of unity that would last. And in the heights of the Red Keep, 3 dragons grew day by day, harbingers of both the realm's storied past and an uncharted future. Whether that future held prosperity or conflagration remained to be seen, but it belonged now to Jon and Gendry, the Blacksmith King and the White Wolf King, who had found 3 eggs in the ice of the Frostfangs and hatched a new era from their shells. They stood together on a precipice, resolved to steer Westeros through the storms yet to come, guided by duty, bound by destiny, and watched over by fire made flesh. Only time would reveal the true measure of their reign and the lasting legacy of the dragons born again into a world haunted by the ghosts of war.